Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the final report on the resiliency of South Carolina's electric and natural gas infrastructure against extreme winter storm events. My name is Landon Masters. I'm the Community Outreach and Communications Manager for the South Carolina Office of Regulatory Staff. And I want to go over a couple of housekeeping items before we get into the meat of today's webinar. So we are using the Zoom platform, and this platform has a couple of different options at the bottom. And that's where you'll find your chat box, which is the most important thing for today's webinar, because that is where we will be taking questions. That chat box is going to be available for the whole webinar to be able to input questions and ask them at any time. As we go through the presentation, if there's a question that is relevant at that exact moment to what our presenter is talking about, we'll stop and try to address the question. If we don't get to it, don't worry, because we do have a Q&A section or time set aside at the end of the presentation for any questions that we have not answered throughout the duration of the webinar. So everyone has been admitted as an attendee with your microphone muted. It would also be, we would ask that if you could turn off your video during the webinar. I think that would help us to focus on the speaker as they're giving their portion of the presentation. We are recording today's webinar as well, so if you know someone that was not able to attend, that webinar will be available on the Office of Regulatory Staff's website on the page that we've dedicated to information about this report. That is also the page where you can find the PDF and the version of this final report, as well as other information relevant to completing the completion of this report. So with that, I will turn this over to Michael Seaman-Wynn with the Office of Regulatory Staff, who is going to introduce us into this final report.
Thank you, Landon. Appreciate the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final webinar, hopefully, on the report on the resiliency of South Carolina's electric and natural gas infrastructure against extreme winter weather events. This, as y'all know, has come out due to Governor McMaster requesting us undertake this study coming out of the winter storms of February 2021. As Landon said, I am Michael Seaman-Wynn. I am the Deputy Director of Energy Operations and have been the project lead on the resiliency study. So in today's webinar, we'll be discussing the final report, the analysis conducted by ORS and by Guidehouse, and going through recommendations in the report. I do want to reemphasize what Landon said, that the chat box is open for questions and is being actively monitored. So feel free to use that for any questions that you have. Next slide, please, Jamie. So what are we here doing today? So as I said, we're going to be going through at a very high level the final report. We'll be providing information on the assessment framework, identifying the findings, going through recommendations, both from a category of utilities, large electric, small electric, large natural gas, small natural gas, as well as overall recommendations stemming from the report. Next slide, please, Jamie. So Jamie Bond has been the project lead from Guidehouse. Guidehouse has been working very closely with us on this, has been doing a significant amount of work, and has done an excellent job of putting this report together along with us. There've been a lot of long hours, a lot of data that has gone into this, and it's something that we're very proud of. And again, Jamie has been a linchpin in getting that done. So with that in mind, Jamie, I'll turn it over to you.
Michael, thank you. I knew you were going to talk about the long hours because we're good for the 3 a.m. emails. Good afternoon, Jamie Bond, as Michael mentioned. Just to give you all a sense of what we'll talk about today, I will go through the approach that Guidehouse took for conducting the assessment, the framework, and whatnot. And I know many of you are with us who have been participants in previous discussions when we reviewed the draft report. And so I don't want to spend too much time on the details of that. However, I understand some of the participants today are new, so I don't want to gloss over something that might be important to understanding the part that is probably the most important, which is following my going over the assessment process. We'll have our subject matter experts or our evaluation professionals in the gas electric space review the findings and recommendations, and then we'll close out with some overall recommendations. These will be the recommendations that you see in the report, but we can walk through the 10 recommendations that we left with the RRS. With that in mind, I'll just again give a nod to the team that helped develop the report and conduct the analysis. We did have a core team focused on this of professionals with evaluators that were subject matter area professionals, analysts, a dedicated researcher, and we did incorporate in our assessment all of the material that was provided by the assessment participants, the utilities, as well as lessons learned from industry and industry event reports, including the recently issued NERC report for the February event in Texas, last February event in Texas. And so a lot went into the assessment, a lot of hours and a lot of folks that I'm personally grateful for because they made my life a little bit easier. And I'll just note the assessment framework itself. We approached the assessment, again, with a goal of being methodical, using a framework that included a couple of different things to make sure that it was comprehensive and to make sure that we were consistently looking across the groups of utilities so that we could come back with a set of recommendations that would be useful for utilities. So I'll just note here, the assessment focused on people, process, technology. We also included data and governance. And in those areas, there were 11 specific indicators that we focused on in our assessment. You can see those listed here. In the actual final report, I believe Appendix A, we describe what each of these indicators mean specifically in the area of, say, people, technology, governance, etc. But again, the indicators include things like risk management, the ability to marshal mutual assistance, compliance with regulatory requirements, situational awareness, technology, automation, things of that nature. So you'll see all of that described in the report, but this is the context through which the assessment was conducted. And then lastly, here I'll just mention, you'll see the findings are dictated by this, and I'll see my mouse, dictated by these kind of scoring. The foundational is kind of what is expected for the different assessments that were being conducted. So for an assessment group, this is what we expect for this group. We did see evidence of some leading and lagging capabilities. And so lagging would reflect that there might be some foundational components in place, but that there's opportunities that likely should be addressed to get to where those capabilities would be expected to be for that particular assessment group. And leading capabilities where not only are foundational components in place, but that there's actually positioning for future needs and showing industry leading practices. And so, and then you've got the two extremes, the foundational components not in place at all, or you are the model to be strove for in industry. This is a high bar. This is something we probably would see regulatory action around, so we would see a lot of this. One more note I'll just say is that there are some areas where, because of the framework that we used and the specific information that we were looking for to be able to conduct the assessment, you will in the report see instances where there's insufficient data, and that just meant that we weren't able to fully evaluate the area of the framework because the information was not available to do so. But I'll just go keep going. So we conducted an individual assessment for each of the participants in the participating in the assessment, and then we compiled the findings and recommendations into 4 categories. Michael mentioned large electric utilities and small electric utilities, large natural gas utility providers and small natural gas utility providers. That was done for a couple of different reasons, but primarily done so that the findings and recommendations can be pertinent to and actionable for those individuals that were assessed. So, for instance, a recommendation for the large electric utility providers is likely to be applicable for that whole group, whereas if we just issued a recommendation for the whole group, it would only be applicable for, with the intention of it being applicable, say, for small natural gas, there wouldn't be much value for the other groups. So we wanted to do a little bit of segmentation so that the output is not just an assessment, but that it is valuable for the participants, who we greatly appreciate that they did participate and share lots of information. And I'll just note, we incorporated the comments that were shared on the public utilities docket and lots and lots and lots and lots of information that was graciously provided by the utilities. So with that said, I'll go into introducing the folks who will talk about the assessment findings. Just by way of a caveat, disclaimer, I'll just note this was somewhat of a tabletop exercise in that we were looking at material that was self-reported by the participants of the assessment. We did not go out into the field and validate anything or lay eyes on any specific infrastructure. We did look at reports and public reports and internal inspection reports and things of that nature, and looked at how they were, how the utilities might have been comprehending and implementing reg requirements. But again, it was a paper kind of an audit exercise. The other thing that I'll mention is that this assessment really did strive to focus on the matter at hand, given the governor's interest in the extreme winter weather in Texas, and assurance that South Carolina was going to be protected and very timely now. We're seeing the winter weather coming into the state. So the assessment did focus on winter weather extreme events. However, it did not cover other events, extreme emergency events like the hurricanes or cyber events, or extreme flooding or any of the other extreme events. Something like that. We just wanted to focus on the areas that needed to be focused on for the sake of this assessment. Very last thing that I'll mention by way of disclaimer, and then I'll turn it over to Ed Battaglia, who what led our a lot of the electric assessments, is that the assessments that were conducted, they were looking backwards, meaning that we were looking at how utilities have performed and how they have prepared to perform for the future. We would look at how the trend, utilities are looking at trends on how they might position, but it doesn't incorporate things like the environment, the future environment changing for the electric and gas operations. So for, as things, as changes might happen in the operating environment, that's a different type of study, for instance, a climate change resiliency study or adaptation study or something of those along those lines. So I want to make sure that the assessment is being taken in the spirit that it was developed. With that said, I do want to turn it over. Well, actually, I'll hit this one and then I'll turn it over to you, Ed. So just tag, you're going to be it soon. So in the final report, you will see it summarize our overall findings. And at a state level, we concluded that the state, the energy system in South Carolina and the providers therein are adequately prepared to prevent or respond to outages that are caused by winter weather, extreme winter weather. You will see some variance across the different categories of utilities. And again, LEU is large electric utilities, large gas utilities, small electric utility, and small gas utility is what these indicators represent, or these acronyms represent. And so you'll see some variance across the different groups. However, one thing to note is that what we did confirm is that the large utilities, the large gas utilities, large electric utilities, they did exhibit the greatest influence over the state's ability to withstand and respond to, or conversely, they would pose the greatest risk if they weren't prepared. So their findings, I won't say trump, but trump any of the findings for the smaller gas and electric utilities, notwithstanding the customers served by those small electric and gas utilities are valued and they care if their service is interrupted. But from a state infrastructure standpoint and from a propagating event standpoint, we do find that the state is adequate, and that the smaller smaller gas and electric utilities where they have opportunities to improve, they do pose quite a lower risk to the overall statewide infrastructure. With that said, Ed, I'm tagging you in now to talk about the large electric utility providers.
Thank you, Jamie. Good afternoon, everyone. Ed Battaglia. I actually led the assessment for helping out with the assessment of the bulk electric system, meaning to say the whole transmission grid for South Carolina, as well as focusing on the large electric utilities, and then helping out with the electric utility providers on the small electric. So I've been with Guidehouse for 3 years, but spent most of my career working with a utility in Florida Power and Light. So a lot of the experience that I bring to the table is really looking at all the preparedness and assessments on risk related to this framework that we had developed for this study. As far as the summary for large electric utility providers, across the board, if you look at the rating from a maturity basis, compared to a foundational, meaning to say what we expect from industry for large electric utility providers, they are leading across the board. So that is really good news. And we went back and forth in a lot of the stuff. So I think one thing that we observe is because of the event in the Texas, and usually utilities through other organizations, the large electric utilities share information. And therefore, probably because of that event, they really honed up on their skills on this one. So I think they demonstrated through the data that we collected that they are above the fold, so to speak, when it comes to their maturity. From notable finding, which is really important, they have fully integrated incident command structures, and they have trained their emergency teams and personnel, which is really essential to preparedness. From a documentation basis, we verified that they have strong documented storm plans, which is really covering the winter events. And then from a mutual assistance basis, with their work with signed agreements through the Southeast Electric Mutual Assistance, they are a participant, and if needed, they call on their neighbors as necessary, including within the other providers within the state. They've also made good use of incorporating supporting technologies to help them in not only in the operations side during events, but taking advantage of technology to communicating status with customers, which is really important. The customers need to know what's going on. And from a compliance perspective, they are well aware of their accountability to adhere to federal and state resiliency requirements. So good rating across the board for the large electrics. Next slide, please, Jamie. We have pointed out several recommendations specific to the large electrics in our report. I highlighted a few because it's hard to go down the list just to make sure we can focus on the things which I think today it's really important just to highlight that a recommendation to implement robust decision-making process for long-term investment to reduce risk need to be there. And what do we mean by this is really assessing the risk of assets all the way down to making sure that from a long-term investment basis, you use that to reduce the risk. Because in some cases, you have the large electric have some reliability program, but there are now methods that really, what we allude to is look forward basis based on risk. And not only, the 3 to 5 year time frame, but these are long-lived assets. You can actually look forward to what does it take to make sure you minimize the risk for the long term, like 30 years or so or plus. The other one that we recommend for large electric is to that condition assessment, which is a necessary thing for preparedness, especially for if you look at your inspection plans, to make sure that at least before the storm season or the winter season, there's a schedule where high risk is inspected, or those things that are really highly vulnerable have that program so that you can really reprioritize as necessary which ones to inspect. And the other one that we observe, I think, based on the material that we received, and I think it's necessary, is to consider some mechanisms wherein you take care of the supply chain, right? You might be ready with all the mutual aid and all that kind of stuff. It's really the inventory management for spares, especially for highly vulnerable equipment for the winter storm. So those three things I highlighted here. I know we noted down several stuff, and we have a full appendix on how we explain the specific recommendations for the large electric. The next slide is the small electric providers. The baseline here is, most of which are foundational, meaning to say it is expected for those types of utilities that they need it. There's some improvement opportunities that needed to be done in asset management and inspection, in the system hardening indicator, which is really the long-term planning to make sure that, again, the process of planning for the system in the future. Things done with stakeholder engagement. I think there's internally a good set of organization within the small electric space. What we're recommending here is probably look outside more so that you can involve what's going on with the small electric space. And then this indicator on automation, this is indicative of the investments of the hardening pieces. And then obviously when you have automation, it impacts the situational awareness component. So I think those things are not in trouble, but it's more of a try to get it into the standard way of what we expect for small electric utility. But overall, I think the notable finding with regards to the basic level of risk is there. And I think a more detailed vulnerability risk assessment for cold weather needs to be conducted as much as possible. I mean, really document it so that you can have a risk profile so it triggers that asset investment and hardening. And like I said, on a mutual assistance basis, the response plans are very, very solid. The improvement opportunity there is to involve more of third-party coordination, because in essence, the small electrics are mainly on the distribution level and therefore be more coordinated with external parties in cases like that. And then the last one is, like I mentioned, on on the system hardening side. The foundational components are in there, but like I said, the triggers of risk management needs to be there so that you can trigger the right targeted investment for cold weather preparedness. So I think those are the notable findings for the small electric. So when we summarize some of the key recommendations, and next slide, I highlighted 3 things that are perhaps related to those improvement opportunities. Is that from emergency response procedures and communication plans, and of course the backup contingency plans for critical facilities. This needs to be solidified further if it applies to that small electric. And the key thing here is because of that more robust documentation, you can use that for employee training and eventually down to evolve to tabletop exercises and perhaps more formalized and coordinated annual drills. The other thing that will help in the investment decision process is that other bulleted item there on basic risk management to identify the mitigation strategies that are necessary, because it's no longer just a list of assets that are vulnerable. It's really monitoring the current state of risk so you can probably prioritize your capital plan. At the same time, when you finally deploy that mitigation plan, you always look at that risk priority so that as necessary, you can change your work schedule or their capitalization schedule as you go. And the other one that I highlighted here is to refine the mutual assistance plan to look for improvements. Again, the mutual assistance plan is important because a lot of mutual aid comes into your territory and they're not familiar with your procedures. So in essence, what needs to get done is formalize those things, probably have an onboarding kind of process to help out in mutual assistance, so that when they're there, you really focusing the extra help on really refining that assistance. So those, and like similar to the list of recommendations we had provided for the large electric, we have a lot of things in there in the appendix that I think it's worth your read to look if it applies to you to make it actionable. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Keith to discuss the natural gas utilities.
All right, thank you, Ed. Similar to Ed, I've been with Guidehouse for about 3 years. My role in the project, I was the lead of the gas evaluation, and I helped develop the matrix that we use for the evaluation. Prior to Guidehouse, I was with Avangrid in the Northeast, so I have extensive electric and gas operations and engineering experience, and had the pleasure of working through 4 seasons of emergency events. So I'll start with the natural gas utility providers, and I just wanted to step back for a second. And when we look through the large natural gas providers and the small natural gas providers, you have to step back and think about what the operating environment they work within, and their resources that they have to expand their capabilities. So when we evaluated the natural gas utility providers, you can see the indicators, all of them scored either foundational or leading. So this is what we expected with a larger investor-owned utility. They did very well, and I'll go through some notable findings, but the overall finding here is that the large natural gas utility providers, they are very well prepared for an adverse weather event through what they do in their normal day-to-day business planning and operations. Similar to what Ed noted, very good fully integrated incident command structures and demonstrated use of standardized approaches. They had very good distribution integrity and transmission integrity management plans, where they evaluated risks in a much deeper manner than sometimes what we normally see in a DIMP or TIMP for a gas utility. Very good programs for asset management ensuring the critical infrastructure will operate during adverse weather events. Again, we saw, and this was, again, one of the leading indicators that we evaluated. Use of technology for engaging stakeholders before and during after severe weather events. So they had very well established processes, not only for stakeholder engagement and public communications during and prior a severe weather event. And again, they demonstrated very good adherence to federal and state resiliency requirements. And this was industry leading. Next slide, please. So for specific recommendations, I'll concentrate on 4 here. And remember, if we go back to the previous slide, these are fine tuning of already foundational or leading practices. So let's keep that in mind, that these large gas utilities are very well prepared. And our recommendations here is sort of additions and fine tuning to what they already do well. And I'll use some corollaries here. We go down to the 4th bullet on the left. Prediction models for preparing impacts of extreme weather events and needs for assigning mutual assistance crews, especially for electric distribution and transmission utilities. We see increasing use of very complex prediction models. And the corollary here is to use these same kind of models for the large gas utilities. Going down to the next bullet, something that we saw missing from the plans, and we're not sure if the large gas utilities actually do this or not, but we're saying you should evaluate your black start capabilities for key purchase points and regulator stations. This is something that we saw as a baseline capability that should be enacted. Going down to the last bullet on the left, something that we see, and this is for some of the utilities in the West Coast for wildfire management, they have very good operating protocols for severe weather that causes wildfires. And we see a very good corollary here for severe winter weather events. So we're recommending here that come up with more universal operating protocols, procedures, train people on these operating protocols and procedures. So if and when a severe winter weather event does come up, the documentation is there, you've evaluated it, and people are properly trained. And the last one is the 3rd bullet on the right. And that is to establish defined program and annual budget for cold winter weather resilience. This doesn't mean that the large gas utilities aren't already planning for these things and their baseline capabilities. We're just saying here, fine-tune things, have a defined program, have defined responsibility, and assign an annual budget for winter weather resilience. Next slide, please. So when we step back and look at the small gas utility providers, and you can see from the indicators that we got, as Jamie covered earlier, we had limited information, so we were only able to score 3 of the 11 indicators. Again, stepping back, these are small natural gas utilities that in general serve small communities, so they have less capabilities naturally by the size and the scale of who and what they are and who they serve. So I'll be talking more about improving baseline capabilities than fine-tuning of baseline capabilities that they already have. So some of the key things here are, we'd like to see a little more detailed documentation in the distribution integrity management programs, the transmission integrity management programs. Through the ones that we evaluated, some of these severe winter weather events have never happened for some of the small natural gas utilities, but that isn't any reason not to do a risk assessment and study on it. So we're recommending that there's a little deeper study in the DIMP and the TIMP. Another notable finding is specific investments for mitigating climate change and extreme weather to customers. Some of the foundational components are in place, but we think that there's some minor improvements that can be made. And again, we saw adequate compliance to the regulations. Last slide, please. Again, putting this in perspective, and I'm going to cover just 3 things here. This is, again, more about defining and improving baseline capabilities. And although it's not listed here, the core recommendation here is that the small gas utilities work together through an industry group, pool their expertise, share information, and see if they can together grow their baseline capabilities. So one thing that we saw was emergency management was definitely an area that needs improvement, specifically to have very specific emergency management plans, have emergency management drills, have tabletop exercises, and involve your local community. Again, these are small utilities that serve small areas, so we think it's very important that you work with your local emergency management agency to have these drills, emergency plan training, and improve stakeholder engagement and communications. The next one would be to look through, and it's the 4th bullet down, Jamie, include a comprehensive list of severe winter weather risks and mitigations in the DIMPs and TMPs. For the most part, these were excluded from the DIMPs. It's our recommendation that the small gas utilities, again, I think they share information and approaches. They all had a similar approach to the way they did their distribution integrity management programs. Get together, share information, look at the risks and mitigation actions for severe winter weather events. And the last would be in the middle over to the right. Again, because you serve small communities, begin engaging with your local stakeholders. Plan emergency drills, plan your communications, plan your stakeholder engagement for severe winter weather events.
Keith, thank you. And
Thank you.
so that concludes the utility group specific walk down of the assessment. I will quickly go through the final 10 recommendations that you will find in the final report. And then I want to make sure that we leave time for any questions that you may have. So for the final recommendations, and Keith, I think the one that you were looking for, I didn't include because it is one on the final recommendation list because it was the important one, is for both the electric and the natural gas utilities. We want the provider should strengthen existing procedures for cold weather. The preparedness, the planning, engineering, and operations, the coordination to prevent extended interruptions in natural gas and electric services. That, of course, they should. Sorry, my screen was going weird over here. They should have enhanced enforcement. Enhance and enforce operations around mitigating disruption. And then the entities that are under the NERC jurisdiction for their reliability standards, there were some really good recommendations that came out of the NERC Texas report that these entities should, the natural gas and electric utilities should make sure that they're reviewing and considering. For recommendation 2, electric, this is applies to the electric utility providers, should evaluate the bulk power system reliability under more extreme conditions than what is represented in the NERC and CERC guidelines. So things like consider extended cold weather conditions. So we saw this, in probably some of you remember, some of the polar vortexes where the cold weather just lingered. We've seen some lingering storms, lingering hurricanes in this area. We saw lingering heat in the upper Pacific. And so the recommendation is that for the bulk power system, they think about the more extreme conditions, greater loss of transmission lines than is specified. Again, just to make sure that in the most extreme circumstances, these entities are prepared and have response capabilities, or at least have been doing some thinking about how they would respond in these conditions. For recommendation 3, South Carolina, the state, the utility, gas and electric utilities, they should form a task force to evaluate any voluntary adoption of practices that might have been identified in the coming out of the Texas assessment. The Public Utilities Commission of Texas, I think they had some, I don't think they had some legislatively mandated rules instituted around winter weather planning requirements for generation entities and transmission providers. And our recommendation is just that a task force in South Carolina take a look at these and see if there's any that they wanted to voluntarily adopt that would be applicable. For recommendation 4, again, this is targeted at the electric utilities providers. They should adopt current codes and industry best practices for hardening, for greater storm resiliency, and designing for future, with the priority being placed on advanced or enhanced design standards for winter resiliency. This would include things like really looking at their safe loading requirements for distribution poles and severe winter weather risks. We know that ice is going to come, and if the design standards are not designed for lots of ice loading, then that poses problems for utilities and for customers. And for the electric utility providers should evaluate strategic, targeted underground in areas where you've got real exposure to severe winter threats. So for recommendation 5, this is targeted at the natural gas community, natural gas utility provider community. We should consider, and this is kind of, well, no, this is one, but they consider updates to their distribution integrity management plans, the DIMS, and the transmission integrity management plans, the TIMS, operations and maintenance manuals, design standards, and include a focus on adverse winter weather rather than just adverse conditions. For recommendation 6, electric and natural gas utilities are encouraged to collaborate with one another and develop a set of standard emergency preparedness and operating practice guidelines to provide consistent levels of service reliability for the whole state, all South Carolina electric and natural gas customers. There may be guidelines that are established that are voluntary, and then once the utility community finds how valuable some are over others, that those can move to becoming mandatory to ensure that there's value across the state for the utilities and coverage of resilient service provision for customers. For recommendation 7, again, this is really a target recommendation for the state that they should require participation of the natural gas and electric utility providers in adverse winter weather emergency drills. Things like tabletop exercises, or working with local emergency management agencies and their specific planning cycles. And this isn't just limited to the utilities that we assess. We would encourage this to include the propane providers and the petroleum providers. And this will tie to another recommendation that I think we'll end on number 10, but I'll jump to number 8 when I get ahead of myself. So both the electric and natural gas providers, they should actively participate in the regional and national industry groups. These would include, EPRI, the American Gas Association, Southeast Electric Exchange, there's, Municipal Association of South Carolina, and the Carolina Public Gas Association. Again, their utilities or individuals within utilities may be members. And as we all know who are members of organizations, membership does not necessarily mean engagement or active participation, but these organizations are really a great resource for the utilities of South Carolina. So we would encourage the South Carolina utilities to take advantage, contribute to, and get value from these organizations. Number 9, this applies to both electric and natural gas utilities. We should actively participate in the national groups. I was I was looking at the wrong one. I'm sorry. I went through number 9. Number 8 is the feasibility study. They should consider a feasibility study on the cost or cost benefit analysis of the resiliency and reliability enhancement, and consider the opportunities that might come with any federal funding. So again, think about when federal funding comes out and those where you've got almost shovel-ready projects, or at least projects where there have been some pre-work that's done to determine whether it's going to be cost beneficial for your customers. We encourage that work to be done in advance of the opportunities, so that you, when the time comes to try to acquire any funding that's available, there's already kind of a understanding of where the greatest opportunity is, and even some prioritization in that area. So we talked about 9. Finally, for our final recommendation, this is kind of targeted towards the state. We encourage the state to really consider the interdependencies between electric power and other key services that are provided to the citizens of the state. So things like water, wastewater, telecommunication, transportation, and identifying any vulnerabilities in those interdependencies that would come from extreme weather. I think this was very punctuated in the Texas event, where just the dependencies of one utility service to another drove more outages than necessary. And this is something that just understanding these dependencies of the infrastructure can help really target the addressing any vulnerabilities. It's kind of this, if everybody owns it, nobody owns it philosophy, and you really want to identify where those are. And so with that, I will, Michael, turn it over to you to close us out.
Thank you, Jamie. So we want to leave some time available for questions, Q&A. Landon, do we have anything in the chat box?
Yes, Michael, we have one question that came in. So this question asked, was any information gathered from the interstate pipeline companies on their plans for winter weather?
So I can address that. We did not specifically request any information from the interstate pipelines. In looking at the responses to the discovery request from both the large gas utilities as well as the small gas utilities, we're able to make some good generalizations and have a relatively good assessment regarding the interstate pipelines, and feel that both of those entities, both Transco and Southern, are very well placed, not just in South Carolina, but along the entire length of their pipelines to address winter storm issues.
And those are all of the questions that I've seen. We do have another question that's about the slides, and we'll make those available after this webinar. We will post the webinar recording as well as the slides for folks that were not able to attend, they can view this recording or see the slide deck. And we'll send those out to all the folks that registered. And I want to also open up this time to folks that, I know we have some folks that are just on the phones. If you want to unmute yourselves, you can do that as well to ask a question, as well as any other participants that we have in the Zoom platform. If you want to unmute yourself to ask a question, right now would be the time.
Hello all, good afternoon. This is Kamal Robinson with Duke Energy. First and foremost, really appreciate the report and greatly appreciate the content in them. The general question that I have for the ORS as well as Guidehouse is, now that the report has been issued, should we be envisioning any next steps? Obviously, the companies will need to take a look, evaluate, and implement the recommendations, but I wasn't certain whether there would be any statewide initiative to incorporate these recommendations, or whether there will be any commission action. Just trying to get an understanding as to how the implementation should go and whether the ORS or others will be assisting in ensuring that these recommendations are implemented. In addition to, I noticed the task force and some of the other more, I think, statewide initiatives that will be ongoing. Just looking to get a preview on next steps. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Kamal. That's a great question. So I will go ahead and say that our focus to date has been on completing the study, getting the report done, getting the study finalized and in the hands of the governor's office, on the commission's DMS, as well as on published on ORS's website. The focus has been on that, to the point that we haven't addressed next steps yet. We will be taking time through the next quarter to meet internally in the ORS to determine, what we think the next step should look like. I will go ahead and say that each of the utilities, everyone on the line, should take a good look at the recommendations, and as appropriate for your individual utility, whether you're a small electric, a small gas, or what have you, should really take those to heart. Should look at those. And if there are appropriate changes or appropriate items that your utility thinks that they should, take, they should look at taking those steps. But we will be, again, looking at what next steps might be through the course of the next quarter.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
And we did have another question come in through the chat box. I believe it's asking, how are you integrating the IoT and other technology to integrate the grids for the future? I believe.
I'm not sure what the acronym IoT is.
Yes.
Internet of Things, like automation at grid edge, customer technology.
There we go. Okay. Do you want to address that one, Jamie, or?
I honestly, I feel like that question is better directed at the specific utilities. We can speculate, and I see Ed is ready to do. He's got a speculation based on, so I'll let Ed jump in on this one.
Yeah, I think I can approach that more generically as applicable, and the tone of the recommendation obviously is what we're recommending is really look at your entity as it applies for creating a risk management framework, so that you can center based on that risk. For example, the winter storm risk, if it's warranted to do certain actions, right? Could be hardening of the asset. But as you can see, it's really, if you look at an investment curve, it's really centered on 4 areas. One is, of course, prevention. Can you prevent a certain thing happening, and can you invest the right thing there? The next one is, okay, the event occurs, can you mitigate its impact or lessen its impact when it hits you? The third one is restoration. It happens, you gotta let it happen, because it's better that you invest in the faster restoration piece. And the last piece could be the loop, which is preparedness, right? How do you prepare the organization to make sure that you're really prepared in case those events happen? So as applicable, the Internet of Things or devices that you use to monitor could be an investment to help in those 4 buckets. So driven by a risk assessment framework, where do you put that bucket to help out that investment? And what we see prevalent in the industry, a lot of the Internet of Things is really aiding operations, but now they're going towards getting more information now to help in preparedness or prediction of the asset's life, right? Whether it's the asset life itself or because of an external factor. So I think those are the things that should trigger a good program for Internet of Things. It's not just putting them in there, but what's the purpose driven by a risk assessment framework.
Awesome. Thank you, Ed. I don't see any other questions in the chat box, but once again, I will open it up to folks if you'd like to unmute. Right now would be your opportunity to unmute and ask a question. Hearing none there, Michael. So I will turn it back over to you to close us out.
All right, thank you. Hey, Jamie, if you would mind throwing up that last slide. There we are. So if there are no further questions, appreciate everyone's participation. If you do have any follow-up questions or anything further, please feel free to reach out to me directly. As Landon said, the webinar and the presentation will both be posted up on ORS's website. And with that, thank you all for your time, and I hope everyone has a safe weekend from the winter storms and such, and appreciate your attendance. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.